If I were to tell you, or anyone, that the first steps to becoming a truly great fantasy writer is that you must earn a doctorate in linguistics, develop your own fantasy language, and then flesh out the design of your world for a decade or so before writing your first novel in your 40s, you might find that to be a tad daunting. Most people would feel so crushed by the undertaking that they would give up. The truth is, that's just how Tolkien's journey worked out. We're each on our own journey, and no one can tell you what you need to do to get to where you want to end up. But once you've committed to sitting down and nerding out over maps, laws, cultures, religions, politics, and all that cool stuff that we've covered before in world-building basics on this very channel, well, then what? What do we do with our 40-page notebook, our sketchbooks filled with drawings of fantastic beasts and people of import? We want to write about them, but how much is too much? How much world do we stuff into our stories? And when is it too much? Come on now, dear friends. The master of Kung Fu and friendship is not leaving you alone to figure this all out. But before we build a blanket fort and tell each other stories, I'd really appreciate if you'd hit that like and subscribe button. For I have a humble following and must appease the mighty algorithm so that it may show favor upon me and spread my message far. Or something. Anyway, let's talk about world building. Okay, I'm going to start with a hard truth we want to internalize right away. A cool world does not make a cool story. I'm going to repeat that, and you should too. A cool world does not make a cool story. The world of Star Trek is very cool, and it sometimes has had bad stories. The world of Star Wars is cool, and has sometimes had some bad stories. I would honestly say that in order to be the best storyteller you possibly can, look at it this way. World building is where you get to be your most creative without any chains or limits whatsoever. If you can think of an idea, figure out the kinks and work them out, you can make anything make sense. It's your world, right? Sometimes you end up just slapping a big old "It's magic" sticker on something you can't fully explain. Is that great world building? No, but it hasn't stopped countless fantasy worlds from using it as a crutch for centuries now. On the other side of that, though, is storytelling. I would argue that storytelling is where you're most restrained, most chained in creativity. This is not a bad thing. If you're serving a beginning-to-end narrative, and it's the story you've chosen and believe it, and this is your baby, then those shackles are a part of a labor of love. They keep you honest to that narrative, and they don't let you go off on crazy tangents. Some examples are keeping your primary narrative and subplots on track, staying true to the voice of each of your characters, understanding the motivations of your antagonists and how their plans are at odds with your protagonists, wrapping up your story without leaving anything unexplored or unresolved. These are all constraints, and the best writers put those on themselves willingly and gladly. The worst writers shrug them off, and what you get are subplots that compete with the main narrative, characters that behave in ways that are baffling to your audience, villains that are almost as much a set piece as their evil lair, having no real agency other than twirling their mustache, and stories that end abruptly with meat on the bone and leave audiences unsatisfied. You see it all the time, even if you can't put a word on it. You walk out of a movie or you close a book and you're feeling like, this was great until the last 20 minutes, or that's it? I don't get it. What was the point? Sometimes it's so overindulgent in living in its world or its message that the narrative itself makes no sense. We often see that with indie Oscar contenders and A24 movies, which I often refer to as having too much artsy in their fartsy. But DC, you don't know what you're talking about. Don't you appreciate metaphor? Well, guy that talks to your screen, I love a metaphor as much as the next guy, but a metaphor doesn't make for a compelling story by itself, any more than a cool world does. If the entirety of your story was to build up to a single twist, a message, or some aha moment when your audience realizes that you tricked them, you haven't written a story, you wrote a joke. The twist is the punchline. If that's what you're going for, more power to you. If you actually have something based on your personal experiences and your unique take on the world to say, then a story probably serves you better. In short, the story comes first. Now, if we've agreed upon that and we're settling into the idea, what the heck are we going to do with all those notepads and sketchbooks we filled up with cool ideas? Well, the really cool thing about world building is that it answers questions. Some are for the reader, like what are the rules of this world? What is the time and the setting? Is there magic or technology present? And what does it look like? This is all cool stuff you get to tell from your sketchbooks and notepads, and really make the characters feel like they're walking around in a living, breathing world. Even better than that, your world building is also going to answer questions you didn't know you had. Imagine a scene in a medieval town just outside a capital city. Our heroes are new in town and trying to get the lay of the land, and they happen upon a tavern. With them is a dwarven warrior. Well, how are dwarves treated in this town? Are they considered special here? Are they known and loved? Or is there possibly a prejudice against them? How will conversations go when people notice the dwarf in the group? You see, these are questions you may not have known you'd have until you're sitting there writing the page. Of course, the answer could just be as simple as, he's another person in a very large town and it doesn't make a difference at all. And that's fine too. Your world building isn't just about paragraphs of exposition on magic systems. Sometimes its best purpose is to inform the behaviors and routines of your characters as they navigate the world you've created for them. Now, that last bit is a real doozy because you have to understand it. Say the mantra again. Cool worlds do not make cool stories. Not by themselves, at least. So make sure that you understand that the super awesome and cool world you've built and crafted lovingly is joined with an equally fleshed out and clear story. You made the world for that story, so make them both memorable, not just one. So, let's do a mind exercise. Speaking only for myself, at any given time I have more stories cooking in my brain than I will ever have the time to explore, let alone write. Since 2016, I've written 16 novels, which on paper is about 2 books a year, but in practicality it's more like 3. At 3 books a year, that's 1 trilogy a year, or 1/3 of a longer series like the Dragon's Dream saga, or 3 standalone novels. Given that I'm an indie author, I have to try to strike a balance between what I'm most passionate about versus what I think will have an appeal to a wide audience. For example, I know that the standalone horror novel I wrote, In Shadows, was going to be insanely difficult for me to market. Most fans know me as a sci-fi and fantasy writer, and that doesn't overlap with horror as much as you'd think. Plus, horror is already a pretty niche genre as it is. Couple that with the fact that it's a standalone novel, and that means I have to work 3 times as hard at marketing for that than I would for a trilogy. But this was one passion project I genuinely believed in, and it's some of the best writing I've ever done, so I went forward with it despite the risks. Now, what do I mean by risk? Well, to get into the business side for a very brief moment, what I can tell you is that if I were to invest $1 in advertising on a standalone book, and I sell $1 in royalties on the book, I have broken even. Now, if I do the exact same thing with a trilogy, I only ever have to market the first book, so I make $1 off the first book, that breaks me even. I make $1 on the next book and the third book in the series, and I've made $2 extra for every $1 I invested. That is a business decision that you have to make. That's the ugly side of the business part of the writing business, and unfortunately, it is what it is. I say all that to say this. World building is a huge undertaking. Writing and completing a story in that world makes the unfettered fun of world building look like scribbly doodles compared to the Sistine Chapel. I've often joked that if I had one clue when I started my writing journey that I would find out writing was the easiest part, I probably would have quit before I started. Sometimes you don't know what you're capable of until you take the first step climbing a mountain. And maybe it's not as important that you know how tall the mountain is, just that you get to the top in your own time. What I'm trying to tell you is that if you've invested a heck of a lot into designing your world, make sure that you're developing a story that can show it off in all of its glory. Give me the best possible story in a world that is truly your own. Now, what do you leave out? Well, my first reaction to that question is always going to be to leave out anything that isn't serving the story. Yes, I know, Tolkien wrote for 3 pages describing a tree, but we all know that because it's an example of what we don't really do. Different time, different audience, and we're different authors. The real trick, though, is having a world so developed that it feels more alive by what you leave out. I'll give you an example of what I mean. By the time this hits YouTube, I will have published book 2 of the Time Incursion trilogy, with the final book coming at the end of February. In this series, the two main characters are on the run back and forth through time, chasing after a madman that invented time travel. This is a villain so intelligent, so versed in what he's doing, that he's perpetually several steps ahead of our heroes for almost the entirety of the story. Because the narrative is always from the hero's point of view, I don't need to tell you how smart he is. You don't see it because of what I told you, you see it because of what you didn't see. How did the villain hatch such a plan? Why are our heroes' attempts to thwart him met with such resistance? I'm dropping clues here and there, remnants of the battles that only make sense in hindsight. I'm alluding to what might have happened, but I'm not confirming it. What I'm doing is leaving out the mustache-twirling exposition from the bad guy explaining why he's so smart, and let the story speak for itself. Trust your audience to have an imagination. They're going to speculate. They might theorize the exact same thing that's in your world building, the same answers you came up with, but they might not. Sometimes they might come up with something spectacularly different, maybe even better. So remember, sometimes what you leave out is almost as important as what you put into it. Okay? So what's the answer? How much world building makes it into your story? The answer could be summed up as exactly the amount needed to tell your story. No more, no less. For every story, that's going to differ, but the best guideline I can give you is the axiom right there. Trust your gut and don't fall in love with your own world building. You'll know when you're being overindulgent or trying to show off something that you came up with that you thought was cool. Don't be afraid to cut these scenes if they're not furthering your story in a meaningful way. Remember, it's your world. You can always find another tale to tell inside of it. I had this weird, unworked comparison going on in my head while I was writing this, that if you look at the rulebook of any tabletop RPG, you're basically consuming the raw cookie dough of storytelling. Well, that's all we have time for this week, but as always, feel free to share things you'd like to see me cover in future episodes. Don't forget, I have a newsletter that goes out twice a month if you'd like to sign up and hear about the latest books I'm working on, and I also share other indie authors in it for you to find your next great read. The link's in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe and all that jazz. Now have fun and get crafting.